in each of your presentation, most of the evidence points to very large general benefits from people moving, from immigration, and very high costs from having barriers. Now, as economists, we are very comfortable with this approach because it's sort of an efficiency approach, or inefficiency in the case of barriers. This shows up in each of these different species. We see that when people are allowed to move, as is in some of the evidence that Frank's pointed out, there are large benefits, there are not large costs on average. Where Lant pointed out to some distortions that we would have probably from not letting an allocation of resources that would follow some efficiency principle, and also we point, Matt points out to some consequences of creating distortions in some regions, and then people move elsewhere and bring benefits elsewhere. So it's all about efficiency and benefits. Now we know that politically there is a lot of opposition to immigration. There are a lot. Now, as a political economist, I would say, well, there are two possibilities. One would be people are just ignorant. They don't know these benefits. They think they disregard them for cultural reasons or for other reasons. So that's a possible explanation. It cannot be the whole story. We know also, as political economists, as economists, that there are large distributional implications, that there are distributional costs, or at least potentially there could be. So I would like each of you to point out what are, when you look at your benefits, is there a trade, or there is not, I mean, maybe there are not these costs, is there a trade-off towards which your benefits have to be traded? Are there costs for, and I will be more specific. So in the case of Frank, for example, there are a lot of these benefits from mobility, but you point to mobility especially from diversity, from having people that come with these different letters of the alphabet, as it was pointed out. You have different letters of the alphabet you match. A lot of the actual movements of people very often is groups of people that for other reasons, for cultural institutional reasons, move in a more homogeneous way. You have clusters of more similar peoples. You don't have the same kind of, so the kind of economically efficient distribution of people is not the same as what we actually see. So what are the implications of policy for that? So that's the question for Frank. Now the question for Lant, as you already preempted the question whether you are a Luddite and you believe that technological progress is better. I know that that's not the implication, but should we expect always that by, I mean, given that there is this technological progress which is labor saving, is this completely irrational? Is this completely anti-economic? Or is it in the longer run, historically we have seen the labor-saving devices have led to some technological progress, and in the longer run it could be that the unskilled laborers eventually may become skilled with benefit. So what is this just a short-term problem, or is it a longer-term problem? Is there a trade-off between long-term and short-term? And in the case of Matt, again, there is the point of view of the employees, but there is also the point of view of the firms. Now, the point of view of the firms, one could say, well, maybe there was a trade-off, or maybe these firms would benefit up to a point from computer. There is a problem about allocation of firms. Is there any evidence that firms themselves would prefer to be protected, or is this really a political, an institutional mistake, a policy mistake? So even the firms themselves, after all, exactly because of this side effects, would prefer to have the workers be free to compete if they could. If they could choose an institutional setting. So now I will let each of you answer these questions, and then I will open the floor to other questions. So again, in the order of number of miles that you have to travel from your birthplace, to be fair.
Okay, thank you. And that's a great question. The literature on migration indeed suggests that there might be very strong negative effects for certain groups. And that depends to what extent the migrants are similar or complementary to you. So people have been slicing down the groups in the labor force and trying to have migrants have different level of experience and different level of education, and see how the locals of different levels of education and experience would respond in terms of their wages. Now, in what we at the Growth Lab have been emphasizing is that there are so many different types of specialization that you can acquire in a modern economy that there are many opportunities for complementarities. So complementarities, if you are surrounded by similar workers, you are actually you actually don't benefit that much from it. You see your wages go down. If you have complementary co-workers, you actually see your wages increase massively. And migration is one of these things that pushes certain types of workers. But what turns out is that, so there is a big debate in labor economics, but I think most of the evidence seems to suggest that the people that are really hurt by migrations might be the migrants themselves. So there's one very nice paper from the 1990s about when the boat lift from Cuba arrived in Miami, and the effect there was that wages of even of low-skill workers in Miami didn't change that much, but maybe a little bit of the Cubans that were already there. So I guess that in a world where the number of capabilities keeps on increasing, the opportunity for complementarity is going up over time.
Very good. Lant.
So, two things. A, I dispute the premise that ignorance isn't a good explanation. I think economists tend to assume that voters are well informed, understand causal models, and are essentially voting their interests. I think that's crap. I think that's just wrong. I think it's a disciplinary bias of ours. I think Brian Kaplan has a book called The Myth of the Rational Voter, where he just shows people just don't understand this. So the idea that people actually understand their interests and are actually voting in some sophisticated way of their interests, I think is just deeply flawed as a way of thinking about it. So, you know, people just don't understand this, and I think they have fundamentally wrong intuitive models. They think a job is like a glass of water and it's excludable, whereas it's just not, and I think they have just fundamentally wrong causal models about the rule, so I think they're ignorant. B, I think there's a more sophisticated point, which is the short run, long run point, which is depending on the strength of the induced substitution, benefiting yourself today can hurt yourself in the long run. So suppose I'm a monopoly in anything, copper. And I think, great, I'm a monopoly in copper. I'm going to use, you know, both my monopoly power and perhaps political power to increase the current price of copper. No question that increasing the current price of copper in the short run benefits the producers of copper. But if then people say, gee, I might unleash a set of dynamics where people say it's really important for me to economize on copper, they might invent something that in the long run drives the copper much lower. So because once you're, and it depends on, again, the power of the induced substitution in the long run. I actually think we have made the mistake. So if you look at the United States, right, the largest social problem in the United States is the long run stagnation of unskilled labor wages. I think the primary explanation for that is technological substitution, of that technology has gotten very good at displacing unskilled labor. And I think at least part of that is that we made the mistake of making labor too expensive through a variety of market distortions, and now we're seeing the long run blowback of that. So that short run long thing depends on how strong you think the induced innovation effect is. I tend to be in awe of capitalism. Once you unleash the capitalist dynamic of innovation on a problem, at however distorted relative prices, it tends to be amazing in terms of what it can invent and market and create. And I think we've just unleashed this thing, and now it's eating away at demand even for low-skilled workers in the US, to where 25%, 25% today, I mean, 30 years ago, only 5% of prime-age males, low-skilled prime-age males in the United States were out of the labor force. Now it's 25%. Where, who took all those jobs? I did. It's crazy.
Very good. Matt.
Sure. I think the answer depends on what you're trying to optimize for. So if you're trying to optimize for employee productivity, happiness, et cetera, very easy answer. If you're trying to optimize for the performance of firms, I think it depends on size. Right. Large firms, and I have a paper showing that large public firms benefit from non-competes very clearly. Small companies, not as clear. On the one hand, it may be very hard for a small company to get started at all, for people to leave and start a new company, and also for small companies to hire. because the big companies can sue those employees who are moving, and the small ones can't defend themselves. So I think policymakers are a little bit befuddled. And I think when you go to hearings, you'll hear employees and startups and even venture capitalists testifying against non-competes. And then, not always publicly, but at least sometimes behind the scenes, large companies and trade associations will be testifying, don't change a thing, we love it here in Massachusetts. And I think it's going to be a tussle. And it's maybe why states like Hawaii with less industry are moving more quickly to take reforms.
Or Utah.
Thank you very much. Now we have
Moving
time
to
for a few
non-competes.
questions. Okay, so there's a microphone.
Is it on? There we go. Lant, I wonder if you know the story of the Bechtel vice president who toured the construction of the Three Gorges Dam.
No, that's a great story, though.
And
See
he's
already.
there and he sees 200 laborers with shovels. And he says to the guy who's giving him the tour, you know, one Caterpillar D9 could do that work. And the guy says to him, yeah, well, you're from the US, you don't have the 200 laborers. And the Bechtel guy turns to him and says, why don't you give them teaspoons? You don't get that. If you want to...
Yeah, but that's dumb. I mean, I get it, but it's dumb.
All right, so here's my...
I mean,
It seems to me your suggestion.
no,
actually.
not at all.
All right, let me
That's just wrong.
let me give you an alternative hypothesis for what's wrong here. And maybe it is that our system is, for some reason, producing too much of an unwanted good, namely unskilled labor. So why wouldn't we want to reduce the supply of this unbought good?
Wow, you're a bold person.
Rather
We
than-
called this eugenics in the 1920s, and we kind of gave up that point of view.
So that's the only method you can think of to produce less unskilled labor?
As opposed to...
Education? I mean, if you look at it as comparative statics, then sure. But if you look at it as a dynamic system, then don't you need to do something about the supply and demand here,
Okay,
other than catch you off your snowblower?
okay. So what's dumb about the Bechtel guy, right, is that at the actual scarcity of capital and labor, the shovel was the right technology. You wouldn't adopt a technology that was stupid at existing relative prices. So the point is, the Caterpillar tractor at the existing relative prices of labor and technology, yeah, so you wouldn't use an inferior technology that was inferior relative to the technology you would adopt at the actual prices that reflected actual scarcities. So the teaspoon analogies, I think the Bechtel guys is just dumb, because it's like teaspoons aren't the right technology at the relative prices. So that's just a off point.
So
I mean, I'm not saying you're dumb. I'm saying the
I
Bechtel
understand.
guy's dumb.
But
Anybody from Bechtel in the room?
the broader point is, are there other ways to bring supply and demand into
Again, people are
balance?
expanding education and schooling as fast as they possibly can. And the point is, yes, of course we should educate people. But at current labor supplies, after all, that only happens so fast, right? The stock of people in the world have the education they have, roughly. You can augment their skills in a variety of ways, but we have a stock of people in the world who are 35, 45 years old who have the skills that they have, and those would produce in a market equilibrium a set of relative prices to which technology should adapt. Instead, that's not what we have. We have technology adapting to completely bizarrely created artificial scarcities that we as economists understand in every other domain. I mean, if we had, suppose the United States imposed a tariff of 3,000% on sand, right? All of a sudden, the sand price would be like astronomical, and people would say, let's invent ways to use less sand. That would be dumb. And it would be obviously the distortion, and people would talk about it. Whereas this distortion, nobody even talks about it.
Okay, let's have more questions, please.
Thank you. Juan Carlos Zapata from the Foundation for the Development of Guatemala. I would like some comments on the distortion of labor, specifically on policies that distort labor. Interesting fact, the Doing Business Index, when you talk about redundancy costs, even though they have it now as an appendix, it used to be part of the evaluation. Now it's outside of the evaluation. So I would like your comments on distortion of productivity through labor policies that, for politic reasons, distort the way jobs are creating, and especially in countries like Latin America. If you look at the minimum wage in Guatemala, it's one of the highest in Latin America, but it only is paid for 20% of the economic productive population. So just to know your comments.
So who would like to answer this? Matt, do you want to?
I don't think
Yeah, I think, I mean, this just gets to the fact that for a variety of reasons, we actually create lots of distortions that make labor to firms relatively more expensive than its marginal product. So the labor mobility is often added to already existing distortions that derive a wedge between worker marginal product and cost to the firm, like, like these kinds of distortions to the labor market already, which would induce firms, again, to substitute capital for labor much more so than they would. So anything you do to make labor, more dear to the firm than its marginal product is going to induce firms to substitute, because right now, right now, I look at firms in the U.S. and they're saying the major problem that we face is that labor is dearer than capital and technology, and let's shed labor. And shedding outsourcing and other ways of shedding the obligations of the social and other contractual obligations of having workers is a really popular thing. So Uber is just a way of eroding the labor contract, right? And it appears attractive because of the distortions in labor markets.
So I think I have time for maybe one more question there. Right there.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for this. John Chisholm, Silicon Valley. Lant, I really like and find compelling your thesis that our making labor more expensive than it needs to be for a variety of reasons and in different ways has attracted innovation which might be applied to other things focused on reducing or eliminating labor. And something that it seems to me would make the argument even more compelling would be if you could point to or suggest what are some of the innovations we're not enjoying or aren't happening as a result of this focus. In my book, Unleash Your Inner Company, I mention the ubiquity of wheelchair ramps required by the Americans for Disability Act has likely discouraged investment in smart prosthetics that would enable the wheelchair-bound to truly become independent and enjoy mobility that doesn't require wheelchair ramps. And so in a way, the ADA is further disabling the disabled. Any thoughts or examples of similar innovations we might not be enjoying as a result of the phenomenon you're calling attention to?
I think to start with climate change, right? Climate change is a case where we clearly have the price distortions in the wrong way. We don't have adequately priced carbon, and since we haven't so it's sort of like we have overpriced unskilled labor and underpriced carbon. So I think we would be incredibly further along on low-cost energy sources had we had the right set of relative prices of labor to carbon, for instance. But just, if you look at a lot of domains, we just haven't made a ton of technological progress, like in the generation, for instance, moving water, right? I'm reasonably convinced that moving water around is going to be really central to the future. As climate change changes, we're going to have populations located in areas that might turn out to have much less access to the natural water sources than they had. And if you ask how much technological improvement there is in the speed and facility with which water gets moved, I don't know how much further we are along on that relative to the kind of things the Romans built, right? That's a problem that kind of nobody's thinking about, and that if we didn't have, huge amounts of advanced labor devoting to things like how do we use Moore's law to displace labor, we might be working on more fundamental scientific principles like how do we also cope with climate change through how do we move water around cheaply and safely, how do we, I'm going to sound stupid if I start going into what I think is underinvented, but I think if I thought about it, now that you've said it, I could think of 5 examples if you gave me a day or two of areas that kind of were just, and coming from Silicon Valley, Moore's law is so fantastic at moving electrons around, right, and making computing cheaper. We're often blinded to the fact that a lot of things we do every day and most people in the world do every day, technological progress hasn't been that fast. There hasn't been that fast of technological progress in agriculture, hasn't been that fast of technological progress in lots of fundamental engineering things where who knows what the possibilities are because we're not working on them.